She handed me the glass with a smile. Too wide, too perfect. "A special treat for my favorite mother-in-law," Victoria said, her voice dripping with honeyed sweetness that had fooled my son for 3 years, but never quite convinced me. I looked at the drink, pale pink with a sprig of rosemary floating delicately on top. The ice clinked softly as she set it before me with theatrical care. Around the dinner table, my family chatted and laughed, oblivious to the theater unfolding between us. My son David was deep in conversation with Catherine, Victoria's mother, about some investment opportunity. Neither of them noticed the careful choreography of this moment. Victoria's eyes flicked to me just once a millisecond of expectation, of watching, of waiting. She wanted to see me drink it, needed to see me drink it. Instead, I smiled back. The same practiced smile I'd perfected over months of enduring her subtle cruelties. While she turned to refill Catherine's wine glass, I did something that would change everything. Something I didn't even plan. I slowly reached across the table and switched the glasses. Mine for Catherine's. The special cocktail for the ordinary gin and tonic. No one saw. No one ever did. I placed Catherine's glass in front of her, the same woman who had once called me quaint at David's wedding, who looked at my modest home like it was contagious, who whispered to Victoria whenever I spoke as if my words needed translation. Catherine didn't notice the switch. She was too busy pontificating about her latest real estate acquisition to pay attention to what sat before her. She lifted the glass, clinked it against her daughter's wine, and drank deeply. I waited. 35 minutes. That's all it took. 35 minutes to answer the question that had been burning in my chest for almost 2 years. Was I losing my mind? Or was someone trying to make me think I was... The first sign came as a pause in Catherine's monologue about marble countertops. She blinked twice, touched her forehead, tried to continue speaking. Her words began to slur together like marbles rolling downstairs. "Must be the wine," she laughed, though she'd barely finished half a glass. Victoria leaned forward, her smile faltering for the first time all evening. 5 minutes later, Catherine's face flushed deep red. Her hand trembled as she reached for water. David stood, concern creasing his features. "Are you okay?" She nodded too quickly, then mumbled something about the room spinning. Her words tumbled over each other, incomprehensible. Then came the final moment, the one I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Catherine's hand gripped the table, knuckles white. She looked directly at me, not at her daughter, not at my son, but at me. And I looked back without flinching, without moving, without speaking. In her eyes, I saw the dawning realization that something was very, very wrong. She tried to stand and stumbled sideways, knocking over her glass. The pale pink liquid spread across the white tablecloth, and I caught a whiff of something bitter beneath the rosemary and gin. The room erupted into chaos. David rushed to Catherine's side. Victoria dialed 911, her voice high and frantic. But I remained seated, calm, watching the way I had learned to watch over these long, difficult months. I held up my glass, the one meant for me, still full, still untouched, and whispered to myself, "What a shame. I guess I just wasn't thirsty tonight." Before this moment, before the switch, before the 35 minutes that would change everything, there was just me, Miranda Sterling, a woman who had built a life from nothing but determination and love. I wasn't born into wealth. My late husband Thomas and I started with nothing, a small apartment, 2 jobs each, and dreams bigger than our bank account. We built Sterling Automotive from a single garage bay. Thomas's skilled hands turning rusted metal into purring engines while I managed the books and charmed the customers. By the time Thomas passed 5 years ago, we owned 3 properties, a collection of vintage cars, and a portfolio that would ensure I never wanted for anything. But more than that, We had raised David, our miracle baby, who came to us after years of trying and heartbreak. Thomas used to say David was our greatest restoration project. "Look at that boy," he'd whisper when David was small, watching him help in the garage with greasy hands and an enormous smile. "We built something beautiful there. Miranda." David had been everything to me after Thomas died. Attentive, caring, calling every day to check on me. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd say, using the same words he'd spoken as a 12-year-old when Thomas first got sick. "I'll always take care of you." I believed him, not just because he was my son, but because that's who he was: kind, loyal, protective. Then he met Victoria Ashford at a company barbecue. She was stunning in an effortless way that made rooms turn and conversations pause. Confident, articulate, with a laugh that seemed to pull people into her orbit. She worked in marketing for a tech startup, drove a BMW she'd bought herself, and had the kind of polished sophistication that came from money and breeding. I wanted to like her. For David's sake. I tried. The first time he brought her home, she complimented my pot roast, asked for seconds, admired the family photos lining my mantel, but something in her tone when she called my home cozy made me wonder if that was code for small, old-fashioned, insufficient. I told myself I was being paranoid, protective. The suspicious mother-in-law from every romantic comedy. But that little voice in the back of my mind never stopped whispering warnings. The shift started small, like hairline fractures in fine china. Victoria began correcting David in front of me little things, casual corrections that could pass for playful banter, his pronunciation of a word, his choice of restaurant, his memory of a shared experience. "Actually, honey," she'd say, with that indulgent smile, "it was Tuesday, not Wednesday. You know how you get your days mixed up?" David would laugh nervously, defer to her version. Each correction was a tiny chip at his confidence, so subtle that pointing it out would make me seem petty. Then she turned her attention to me. It was never direct, never obvious enough to call out, but the cuts were there. For Christmas, she gave me an expensive jar of anti-aging cream wrapped in gold ribbon. "It's supposed to work miracles," she said brightly. "I swear by it for mature skin." And another time, she offered to teach me how to use Google Docs since technology can be challenging at your age. When I mentioned a news story I'd read, she'd interrupt with fact checks that made my information sound outdated or incorrect. Each interaction left invisible bruises that no one else could see. The first time I met Catherine Ashford was at David and Victoria's engagement dinner. She arrived in a car that cost more than most people's annual salaries and treated the valet like furniture. During introductions, she barely acknowledged my presence, offering a limp handshake and a smile that never reached her eyes. At dinner, she leaned across the table and asked David, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Are you absolutely certain about this marriage is such a commitment, especially when backgrounds are so different?" The table fell silent. David laughed awkwardly, brushed off the comment. I maintained my smile, but something inside me crystallized in that moment. This wasn't accidental rudeness, it was intentional. Catherine wasn't just rude, she was strategic. As I drove home that night, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. In my rearview mirror, I could see the restaurant's warm lights growing smaller, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving away from my son's life rather than toward my own. The engagement party, the wedding planning, the countless family gatherings that followed, they all became exercises in endurance. I was given seats, not voices, dress codes, not input. I was present, but powerless, watching from the sidelines as Victoria and Catherine orchestrated David's life with increasing boldness. And through it all, that small voice in my head grew louder, more insistent. Something was happening to my family, something deliberate and calculated. But I had no proof, no evidence, only the growing certainty that I was being slowly, systematically erased. I just didn't know how far they were willing to go. The wedding came faster than seemed natural, planned with military precision by Catherine, while I watched from the designated sidelines. Victoria floated down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my car, Catherine beside her in the father's traditional role. No explanation was given for the absence of Victoria's father, just Catherine's imperious presence claiming center stage. During the ceremony, I sat in the second row behind Catherine's friends, behind the wedding party, behind everyone who mattered. When David turned to watch his bride approach, his face showed that familiar mix of awe and nervousness I remembered from his childhood spelling bees. But he never looked back at me, not once. The reception seated me at table 6. Family was at table 1. I smiled through the toasts, clapped for the speeches, held back tears when David thanked everyone who had shaped him into the man he was today, his high school football coach, his college mentor, his boss, but not me, not the woman who had worked double shifts to pay for his uniform, who had driven him to every practice, who had believed in him when he doubted himself. That was the beginning of my exile, though I didn't recognize it then. Marriage didn't change Victoria, it amplified her. Within weeks. She began referring to me as David's mom, instead of using my name, as if I were a distant relative rather than the woman who had raised him. She'd introduce me to strangers with apologetic smiles. "This is Evelyn, sorry. Miranda, David's mother. She means well." The phrase "she means well" became her signature dismissal, a way to frame my every comment as misguided but harmless. I remember the first family dinner after their honeymoon. Victoria served me a plate and announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Careful, it's spicy. I know older people can't handle heat." Everyone laughed, including David. I laughed too, that brittle, hollow sound people make when they're drowning but don't want anyone to notice. Victoria corrected me constantly. If I told a story, she'd interrupt with her version. If I offered advice, she'd respond with patronizing smiles and phrases like, "Well, actually, oh." Everything I said was either outdated or cute in its own way. Slowly, I was being painted as the relic in the room present, but irrelevant. Tolerated, but not treasured. And David stopped seeing it, or chose not to. When I called, Victoria always answered. "He's in a meeting at she'd say. "He's tired. He's taking a call." Once, I called to wish him happy birthday, and she told me he was busy, but she'd pass along the message. I never heard back. Catherine became a permanent fixture in their lives, arriving for dinners, brunches, spontaneous visits. Every time I came to see David, she was already there in my chair, telling my stories, offering my son advice, slowly becoming everything I used to be. The erosion was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that by the time I recognized what was happening, I was already a stranger in my own son's life. The physical symptoms started around the same time as my emotional displacement, though I didn't connect them at first. Just small things, moments of forgetfulness, waves of dizziness that seemed to come from nowhere, a strange fatigue that would wash over me during family gatherings. I'd arrive at David and Victoria's house feeling fine, but leave feeling hollow and confused, as if someone had dimmed the lights inside my head. My hands would tremble while driving home. Sometimes I'd forget entire conversations we'd had, or find myself unable to remember why I'd come to visit. Dr. Harrison ran every test he could think of. Blood pressure, cholesterol, vitamin levels, cognitive assessments. Everything came back normal. Stress, he suggested. Grief. It's not uncommon for widows to experience these kinds of episodes. But I knew my body. I'd lived in it for 65 years, through childbirth and illness and the exhaustion of building a business from nothing. This felt different, foreign. The symptoms seemed to follow a pattern, though it took me weeks to recognize it. They were worst after meals at David's house, after drinking the special teas Victoria would brew for me, after taking the vitamin supplements she'd started providing. "These are so much better than what you get at the drugstore," she'd say, handing me a small container labeled Daily Balance. "They're specifically formulated for women over 60. I'd been taking the same 3 vitamins for years: calcium, vitamin D, a multivitamin doctor Harrison had recommended. My pharmacist knew my routine, my dosage, my schedule. But Victoria's supplements looked similar enough that I started taking them instead, grateful for her thoughtfulness. That's when the symptoms intensified. One morning, I opened my vitamin case and noticed the pills looked slightly different. Same size and color, but with a faint bitter scent I didn't recognize. When I mentioned it to Victoria, she assured me they were the same brand, just a newer formulation. But doubt had taken root. I stopped taking them for a week and felt clearer than I had in months. When I resumed, the fog returned. So I conducted my own small experiment, taking photos of the pills, noting any changes in size, shape, or smell. 2 weeks later, I found several pills crushed to powder at the bottom of the container, and others that seemed to have been opened and resealed. That's when I started my journal. At first, it felt foolish, a spiral-bound notebook hidden in my bedside drawer, filled with entries that read like paranoid rambling, but I documented everything: what I ate, what I drank, who prepared it, how I felt 30 minutes later, an hour later, the next morning. The pattern became undeniable. On days when I ate alone, when I prepared my own meals and took my own vitamins, I was fine, clear-headed, steady, myself. But after visits to David's house, after meals Victoria prepared, after drinking her special teas and smoothies, the symptoms returned like clockwork. One Sunday, she offered me chamomile tea after brunch. "This will help you relax," she said, pressing the warm mug into my hands. I accepted it gratefully, held it while we chatted, but excused myself to the bathroom before taking a sip. I poured the entire cup down the sink, rinsed it clean, and returned it empty. "Feeling better already?" Victoria asked with a knowing smile. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't imagining things, wasn't being paranoid or oversensitive or old. Someone was doing this to me deliberately, systematically, with a patience that spoke of long-term planning. But knowing and proving were two different things entirely. I had been a nurse before I married Thomas, back when women had fewer career options and practical skills mattered more than degrees. I understood medication, dosage, symptoms. More importantly, I understood the importance of documentation. My investigation began in earnest after the chamomile tea incident. I started carrying a small camera, taking pictures of everything: my pills, before and after visits, food I didn't eat, drinks I discreetly disposed of. I labeled and dated everything, storing potential evidence in sealed plastic bags like I was building a case, which, I realized, I researched drug interactions, called my old nursing school friends who still worked in hospitals, and even contacted a friend of Thomas's who worked in forensics. I told him I was writing a mystery novel about elder abuse, needed technical advice about undetectable poisoning methods. "Benzodiazepines," he told me over coffee. If someone wanted to make an elderly person appear confused or forgetful, small doses of certain anxiety medications could do it, especially mixed with alcohol, hard to detect unless you're specifically looking for it. I remembered the glasses of wine Victoria always poured for me, the cocktails, the special beverages that were just for me. My documentation became more sophisticated. I started timing my symptoms, tracking them against specific meals and drinks. I kept a duplicate set of vitamins at home, comparing them daily to the ones in my bag. When discrepancies appeared, and they did, regularly I photographed everything. The most damning evidence came when I started pretending to take medications I actually palmed and saved. Victoria would watch me swallow pills, satisfied, while I tucked them into a tissue to examine later. Some had been scored and refilled. Others dissolved differently in water than they should have. I even began testing Victoria's reactions when I claimed to have forgotten things I hadn't actually forgotten, or when I mentioned feeling confused about events that were perfectly clear in my memory. Her responses were telling, not concerned, but satisfied, almost pleased. "Don't worry," she'd say with that patronizing smile. "Memory issues are normal at your age. Maybe you should mention it to Dr. Harrison." She was building a narrative, I realized, creating a paper trail of my supposed cognitive decline that could be used later. But for what purpose? The answer came when I started paying closer attention to their conversations around me. Victoria and Catherine would speak in half sentences and significant looks when they thought I wasn't listening, dropping phrases like, "when the time comes," and "if something happens," and "for her own good." One evening, I pretended to nap in my chair while they chatted in the kitchen. I heard Catherine clearly, "The lawyer says we need more documentation, medical opinions, evidence of incapacity." Victoria's response chilled me to the bone. "Don't worry, a few more months of this, and even she'll agree she needs help." They weren't just trying to make me sick. They were trying to make me legally incompetent. But I was far from incompetent. I was angry. I was methodical, and I was building an evidence file that would expose everything they'd done. I just needed them to make one final, fatal mistake. The breakthrough came when I decided to search David's old room during one of my visits. Victoria was in the garden with Catherine, pointing out landscaping changes, and David was on a work call. I climbed the stairs to the room that had once been my son's sanctuary, now converted into Victoria's home office. Her laptop was open on the desk, and I couldn't resist a quick glance at the screen. What I saw made my blood freeze. Email threads between Victoria and a law firm specializing in elder care and estate planning. The subject lines told the story: guardianship procedures, medical documentation requirements, asset protection for incapacitated seniors. I photographed the screen with trembling hands, capturing as much as I could before I heard footsteps on the stairs. The correspondents laid out their plan in clinical detail, how to document my deteriorating condition, what medical evidence they needed to petition for guardianship, and how to protect my assets once I was declared legally incompetent. There were even estimates of the estate's value, including Thomas's vintage car collection, our investment portfolio, and the properties we'd acquired over 40 years of marriage. Everything I'd worked for, everything Thomas and I had built together, cataloged like items at an auction. But the most devastating discovery was a separate folder labeled David. Inside were documents showing Victoria had been systematically isolating him from me, intercepting my calls and messages, and feeding him carefully crafted stories about my supposed decline. Screenshots of texts she'd sent him. "Your mom called 3 times today, asking the same question. I'm worried about her. She seemed confused at dinner, kept repeating herself. Maybe we should look into assisted living options." Each message was a lie, a manipulation designed to make my own son doubt my competence. No wonder he'd grown distant. No wonder he looked at me with pity instead of love. Victoria had spent months poisoning his mind against me as surely as she'd been poisoning my body. The final piece of evidence was an email to Catherine from 2 weeks earlier. "M is responding well to the increased dosage, more confusion, better documentation. Dr. H is starting to notice the symptoms. Should have enough for the petition by Christmas." Christmas was 6 weeks away. They planned to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized by the holidays, leaving them free to strip away everything Thomas and I had sacrificed to build. My home, my independence, my dignity, all of it would disappear behind the legal fiction of protecting a confused old woman who couldn't care for herself. But I wasn't confused. I was furious, and I was about to turn their own plan against them. The dinner invitation came 3 days later, exactly as I'd anticipated. Victoria's text was bright and breezy, filled with excessive exclamation points. "Family dinner Saturday. Just us close ones. Can't wait to see you." Miranda. I stared at the message for a long time, understanding its true meaning. This wasn't a social invitation. It was likely meant to be my last performance as a functional adult. One final evening where they could document my deterioration before moving forward with their legal proceedings. I typed back a simple response, looking forward to it. But I had my own plans for Saturday night. I spent the week preparing with the methodical care of a general planning a campaign. I organized my evidence photographs, medical records, the journal I'd been keeping, copies of the emails I'd discovered. Everything went into a folder that I would leave with Arthur Pemberton, my lawyer, on Friday afternoon. If anything happens to me, I told him, if I'm suddenly hospitalized or declared incompetent, or if I simply disappear, I want you to give this directly to the police. Arthur had known our family for 30 years. He looked through this folder with growing alarm, then locked it in his office safe with a promise that my instructions would be followed to the letter. Saturday evening. I dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual. I wanted to look exactly like the woman they expected to see presentable but slightly frail, dignified but diminished. I practiced my facial expressions in the mirror, perfecting the slightly vacant smile of someone whose mind was slipping. I drove to their house through autumn darkness, my hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. The house glowed with warm light, every window perfectly framed like a magazine spread. Even from the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, a beautiful facade hiding something rotten. Victoria greeted me at the door with an embrace that felt like a spider wrapping silk around prey. Miranda, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. Mother's already here. Catherine sat in the living room like a queen holding court, a glass of wine in her hand and pearls around her throat. She offered me the same dismissive smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that made me feel like help, who'd forgotten her place. Miranda, she said without rising, how lovely that you could join us. David appeared from the kitchen, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. He looked so much like his father, the same gentle eyes, the same quick smile. But when he hugged me, it felt perfunctory, distant. I could see the worry in his expression, the careful way he watched me, as if I might suddenly become confused or aggressive. Victoria had trained him well. "Dinner's almost ready," she announced brightly. "But first, I've made something special for tonight, a signature cocktail just for you. Miranda?" She disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the careful sounds of preparation, ice clinking, liquid pouring, the precise movements of someone following a practiced recipe. When she returned, she carried a tall glass filled with pale pink liquid, garnished with fresh rosemary and a twist of lemon. "This is my own creation," she said, setting it before me with ceremonial care. "Gin, elderflower, a touch of rose water, and a few special ingredients I think you'll love." I lifted the glass, admired its color in the light, inhaled the delicate floral scent. "It smells wonderful," I said, and meant it. Then I set it down without drinking and waited for my moment. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. Catherine launched into one of her lengthy monologues about real estate values, gesturing grandly with her wine glass while Victoria refilled everyone's drinks. David excused himself to take a work call, stepping onto the patio with his phone. That left 3 women in a room, but only one was paying attention. While Catherine pontificated and Victoria busied herself with appetizers, I acted with the swift precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. I reached across the table, lifted Catherine's gin and tonic, and smoothly replaced it with my untouched cocktail. The switch took less than 3 seconds. No one saw. No one suspected. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and began the longest 35 minutes of my life. Catherine continued her lecture about marble countertops and property taxes, occasionally sipping from the glass that had been meant for me. Victoria bustled around the kitchen, checking on dinner and occasionally glancing my way with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was proceeding perfectly. I made small talk, complimented the house, asked Victoria about her work. I played the role of the slowly failing woman they expected to see, but inside, I was counting every minute, watching every sip, waiting for the chemistry I'd been enduring for months to finally reveal itself in someone else's body. At the 20-minute mark, Catherine paused mid-sentence, blinking slowly. She touched her forehead, laughed it off, continued speaking. But her words were slightly thicker now, running together at the edges. At 25 minutes, she reached for her water glass with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. At 30 minutes, David returned from his call to find his mother-in-law gripping the edge of the table, her face flushed and her breathing shallow. "Catherine!" Victoria's voice carried the first note of real concern I'd heard from her all evening. "Are you feeling all right?" Catherine tried to answer, but the words came out slurred, incomprehensible. She attempted to stand and swayed dangerously, one hand pressed to her chest. "Call 911, David said sharply, moving to Catherine's side. Victoria fumbled for her phone, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd known her. But I remained seated, watching the chaos unfold with the same calm attention I'd brought to every family gathering where I'd been the one experiencing these symptoms. When the paramedics arrived and began asking questions about what Catherine had consumed, I answered with clinical precision. I described every dish, every ingredient, every drink that had been served. I mentioned the special cocktail Victoria had prepared, the one that now sat empty beside Catherine's chair. "She seemed to enjoy it," I said quietly. "Victoria made it specially for the evening." The EMT bagged the glass immediately. Along with the bottle of gin and the other ingredients, Victoria pointed out with increasingly frantic explanations. But I saw the moment Victoria's confidence shattered completely when the paramedic asked if anyone else had consumed the same drink. "No," Victoria said quickly. "It was just for Catherine. I mean, it was meant for—" She stopped herself. But too late. "Meant for whom?" the paramedic asked. Victoria's eyes met mine across the room. In them, I saw the dawning realization that her perfect plan had just collapsed entirely. "It was meant for me," I said clearly. "But I wasn't thirsty." Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the hospital 3 hours later, by which time Catherine was stable but sedated. The cocktail glass was en route to the state lab, and Victoria's story had changed twice. I sat in the waiting room with my folder of evidence, watching Victoria pace by the windows while David filled out paperwork with shaking hands. When Detective Chen introduced herself, I was ready. "Mrs. Sterling, I understand you were at dinner when Mrs. Ashford became ill." "Yes," I said simply. "My daughter-in-law prepared a special drink for me. I didn't drink it. Mrs. Ashford did instead." I opened my folder and handed Detective Chen my journal, my photographs, my carefully documented timeline of symptoms and events. She flipped through the pages with the neutral expression of someone who'd seen enough domestic abuse cases to recognize patterns. "You've been experiencing similar symptoms," she asked. "For months. Only after eating or drinking things Victoria prepared." I showed her the photos of altered medications, the lab reports I'd requested from Dr. Satoma de Harrison, the email screenshots I'd captured from Victoria's computer. Detective Chen's expression shifted from professional interest to sharp focus. "Mrs. Sterling, do you believe your daughter-in-law has been deliberately administering substances to you without your knowledge?" "I don't believe it," I said quietly. "I know it." The questioning continued for 2 hours. Detective Chen was thorough, methodical, asking me to walk through every incident, every symptom, every piece of evidence I'd collected. When Victoria was called in for her interview, I was allowed to stay in an adjacent room where I could hear through the thin walls. Victoria's version began confidently enough concerned daughter-in-law trying to help an aging woman. Family dinners designed to keep everyone close. Special drinks and supplements meant to support my health and well-being. But when Detective Chen asked specific questions about the medications I'd been taking, about the symptoms I'd reported, about the emails discussing guardianship and estate planning, Victoria's composure began to crack. "I was trying to help," she insisted, her voice rising. "Miranda has been declining for months. Ask David, ask anyone. She's confused, forgetful. Sometimes she doesn't even recognize where she is." "And yet," Detective Chen observed, "she was lucid enough tonight to document exactly what everyone consumed, to remember specific details about the evening's events, and to provide us with months of detailed records about her experiences." The silence that followed was damning. "Mrs. Ashford?" Detective Chen continued. "We found benzodiazepine in your mother's bloodstream, the same substance Mrs. Sterling suspected was being used to drug her. Would you like to explain how that happened?" Victoria's lawyer arrived before she could answer, but the damage was already done. Her story was unraveling as quickly as she could try to patch it together. The toxicology results came back 48 hours later, confirming what I'd suspected for months. The cocktail contained lorazepam, a powerful sedative that, when mixed with alcohol, could cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing: confusion, memory loss, dizziness, disorientation. More testing revealed traces of the same drug in the vitamin supplements Victoria had been providing, in the special teas she'd brewed for me, even in a bottle of wine she'd given me as a gift the previous month. When confronted with the evidence, Victoria's defense finally collapsed. She confessed in pieces, each admission more damaging than the last. Yes, she had been adding medication to my food and drinks. Yes, she had been documenting my resulting symptoms as evidence of cognitive decline. Yes, she and her mother had been consulting with lawyers about guardianship proceedings, but she claimed it was all for my own good. Miranda was struggling. She told Detective Chen during her formal interview. She was forgetting things, getting confused, making poor decisions about her finances. I thought if I could just help her relax, help her see that she needed support, she'd agree to let us help her. The investigators weren't buying it. Deeper digging revealed the true scope of their planned emails between Victoria and Catherine, discussing my estate value, research into asset protection during guardianship proceedings, even preliminary conversations with luxury assisted living facilities. The most damaging evidence came from Victoria's own digital communications. Text messages to Catherine calculating how much money they could control once I was declared incompetent. Search history showing research into untraceable ways to administer sedatives. Bank records revealing that Victoria had already begun redirecting some of my mail and intercepting financial statements. But the revelation that shattered me wasn't about the money or the drugs or even the planned guardianship. It was discovering how completely they had manipulated David. Victoria had been intercepting my calls and messages for months, crafting elaborate lies about my mental state, even staging incidents where I appeared confused or forgetful. My own son had been living in a fictional reality where his mother was slowly losing her mind, and the woman he loved was heroically trying to protect her. The cruelest part was that David genuinely believed he was losing me to dementia. His distance, his careful way of speaking to me, his worried glances, they hadn't been signs of abandonment, but of grief. He'd been mourning my mind while Victoria systematically destroyed it. When Detective Chen showed him the evidence, David didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then he asked the question that broke my heart. "How long has this been going on, based on Mrs. Sterling's documentation?" Detective Chen replied, "Approximately 18 months. 18 months of my son believing I was disappearing, while I was actually being erased." David came to my house 2 days after Victoria's confession, carrying himself like a man who'd aged years in a matter of hours. He sat in Thomas's old chair, something he hadn't done since his father's funeral, and struggled to find words for the unforgivable. "Mom," he said finally, "I'm so sorry. I thought... She convinced me that you were sick, that you needed help." I looked at the son I'd raised, the man I'd thought I'd lost, and saw the boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, but I also saw someone who had chosen to believe convenient lies rather than investigate uncomfortable truths. "She drugged me, David," I said quietly, "for a year and a half. She poisoned me in my own son's house, and you never once questioned why I only seemed confused around her." He flinched as if I'd struck him. "I didn't know. You didn't want to know." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they were true. It was easier to believe I was losing my mind than to consider that the woman you loved might be hurting me. He tried to defend himself, to explain how convincing Victoria had been, how worried he'd been about my health, how guilty he'd felt about not spending more time with me. But his words felt hollow against the weight of 18 months of systematic abuse that he'd witnessed and dismissed. "She showed me texts from you," he said desperately. "Confused messages, repeated calls. She said you were getting aggressive with her, that you accused her of things that didn't make sense." "What texts?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Messages where you seemed lost, asking the same questions over and over, getting angry when she tried to help." I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my message history with David. "Show me." He fumbled with his device, scrolling back through months of conversations. But as he searched, his expression grew more confused, then horrified. "They're not here," he whispered. "The messages. They're gone. Because they never existed. David." "She faked them. She showed you screenshots of conversations that never happened, then deleted the evidence." The reality hit him like a physical blow. His face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the 12-year-old boy who'd cried in my arms the night his father died. "I failed you," he said. "I failed Dad. I failed everything he taught me about protecting family." I wanted to comfort him, to fall back into the familiar role of the mother who made everything better. But 18 months of betrayal had changed something fundamental between us. "Yes," I said simply. "You did." The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we'd lost and couldn't reclaim. Finally, David asked the question I'd been dreading. "What happens now? Can we fix this?" I stood up slowly, walked to the mantelpiece where his childhood photo still sat, and turned it face down. "Some things can't be fixed, and David, they can only be survived." "They can." "Mom, please, I'm not your mother anymore," I said quietly. "I'm a woman who was poisoned in her own son's house while he chose to believe his wife over his own flesh and blood. I'm a victim who gathered evidence for months while her family planned to steal everything she'd worked for. I'm a survivor of something that should never have been survivable." David left without another word, and I watched from my window as his car disappeared down the street that had once brought him home for Christmas dinner and birthday celebrations, that had carried him to school and first dates and all the milestones of a life I'd thought we'd always share. But that life was over. What came next would be entirely mine to decide. The charges came swift and severe. Victoria faced multiple felony counts: assault with a dangerous weapon, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. Catherine, despite her protests of innocence, was charged as an accessory based on the email evidence and financial records. The media picked up the story, "Local woman poisons mother-in-law in estate scheme," but I refused all interview requests. I had no interest in becoming a poster child for elder abuse or a cautionary tale about trusting family. I'd told my story to the people who mattered: the police, the prosecutors, and my lawyer. Arthur Pemberton handled the media attention with his usual discretion, issuing a brief statement that I was cooperating fully with authorities and looked forward to justice being served through proper legal channels. Victoria's trial was scheduled for the following spring, but I wouldn't be there to see it. By then, I'd be far from this place, starting over somewhere no one knew my story or pitied my circumstances. The investigation revealed more than I'd even suspected. Victoria had been systematically stealing from me for months, redirecting mail, intercepting financial statements, even forging my signature on documents that would have given her power of attorney. She'd been patient, methodical, planning for a long-term theft that would have left me with nothing while appearing completely legal. David's awakening to the full scope of Victoria's deception was painful to witness, even from a distance. He discovered credit cards opened in his name, business accounts he'd never authorized, loans against his property that Victoria had secured using forged documents. She'd been systematically destroying his financial life while positioning herself to inherit mine. But the cruelest revelation was finding the engagement ring Thomas had given me 42 years earlier, the ring I'd thought I'd misplaced months ago, in Victoria's jewelry box. She'd been wearing my memories on her finger while poisoning my mind. When Arthur told me about the ring, I felt something inside me finally break free. Not my heart that had been broken long ago, but the last threads of obligation, the final wisps of guilt about what I was planning to do. They had taken everything from me that they could steal, manipulate, or destroy. But they'd forgotten one crucial thing the will was mine to right. 3 days after Victoria's arraignment, I sat in Arthur's office with a cup of tea and a clear conscience, rewriting the legal document that would define my legacy. I want them completely removed, I told Arthur. David, Victoria, Catherine, not a penny, not a photograph, not a mention. Arthur had known our family since David was in elementary school. He'd drawn up the original will that left everything to my son, had updated it when David married, had assumed he was simply maintaining documents for a traditional family inheritance. "Miranda," he said gently, "I understand you're angry, but David was as much a victim of Victoria's manipulation as you were. Are you certain you want to?" "He chose her over me," I interrupted. "Every day for 18 months. He chose to believe her lies rather than trust his own mother. That's not manipulation, Arthur. That's a choice." I'd spent weeks thinking about this decision, weighing love against betrayal, hope against reality. The son I'd raised would never have abandoned me so completely. The man who'd sat in my living room making excuses for his wife's cruelty was someone I no longer recognized. The new will was elegant in its simplicity. Half of the estate, including Thomas's vintage car collection and the family home, would go to veterans charities and the trade school scholarship fund Thomas had always wanted to establish. These were causes that honored his memory and his values, places where our money would help people who understood hard work and sacrifice. The other half would go into a trust for Emma, my 6-year-old granddaughter, to be released when she turned 25. But there were conditions David and Victoria could have no legal or financial control over Emma's inheritance. Arthur would serve as trustee, ensuring the money was protected from her parents' influence. I wrote a letter to accompany the trust, not bitter or vengeful, but honest about what had happened and why I'd made these choices. Emma would read it when she was old enough to understand that family isn't just about blood, but about loyalty, truth, and protection. "I want them to know," I told Arthur as I signed the final documents, "that they didn't just lose my money. They lost the chance to be part of something larger than themselves, something that would have honored Thomas's memory and provided for future generations." The cruelest twist wasn't that David would inherit nothing. It was that he would never know what he'd lost until it was too late to matter. Arthur locked the new will in his safe with instructions that were ironclad upon my death. The estate would be distributed exactly as specified, regardless of any challenges or claims from excluded parties. I'd learned from Thomas's business dealings that the best defense against manipulation was preparation. "What about David?" Arthur asked, as I prepared to leave. Will you tell him about the changes? I considered this carefully. Part of me wanted him to know immediately, to live with the consequences of his choices. But a larger part understood that true justice sometimes required patience. He'll find out when it matters, Hothel, I said. When I'm gone and he realizes that love isn't unconditional, it has to be earned, protected, and honored. He forgot that. Now he'll have the rest of his life to remember. I left town on a Tuesday morning in November, when the leaves were turning and the air carried the promise of winter. I'd sold most of my belongings, keeping only what fit in my car photographs of Thomas, a few pieces of my mother's jewelry, the journal that had saved my life, and the clothes I'd need for a fresh start. I didn't tell David I was leaving. I didn't say goodbye to neighbors or close childhood friends. I simply locked the door of the house where I'd raised my son and drove away from the life that had nearly destroyed me. The coastal town I chose was 3 states away, small enough that strangers didn't ask too many questions, but large enough to offer the services I'd need. I rented a cottage with weathered shingles and a view of the ocean, the kind of place where tourists came to forget their troubles and locals minded their own business. For the first time in 18 months, I could eat and drink without fear. I could take my real medications without wondering if they'd been tampered with. I could sleep without locking my bedroom door or hiding my valuables. Most importantly, I could think clearly. The fog that had clouded my mind for so long lifted completely, revealing the sharp intelligence that had built a business, raised a child, and survived attempted destruction by the people who should have protected me. I found work at the local community center, helping elderly residents navigate Social Security paperwork and Medicare enrollment. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been saved from a nursing home by my own cunning. And now I was helping others protect themselves from the kind of exploitation I'd barely escaped. My supervisor, a kind woman named Linda, knew me only as Mrs. Ann Mitchell. I'd legally changed my name before leaving town. To her, I was a widow with administrative experience, someone who understood bureaucracy and had patience with confused seniors. She had no idea I was also someone who documented her own poisoning, outsmarted a conspiracy to steal her estate, and rebuilt her life from scratch at 65. But I knew, and that knowledge gave me a strength I'd never possessed before. In the evenings, I walked along the beach and felt the salt air clear away the last traces of confusion and doubt. I was exactly who I'd always been, just wiser, stronger, and completely free from the obligation to love people who'd tried to destroy me. The cottage had a small garden where I planted herbs, basil, rosemary, thyme. Every time I watered them, I thought about the cocktail Victoria had made for me, and every time I watched them grow, I was reminded that I'd survived what was meant to kill me. Slowly, quietly, I was blooming again. Epilogue. 3 years later. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning in spring, while I was preparing for the weekly senior citizens' luncheon. Arthur's voice was carefully neutral, the way lawyers sound when they're delivering news that's neither good nor bad, just inevitable. Catherine Ashford died yesterday, he said. Kidney failure, complicated by what the doctors are calling early-onset dementia. She'd been in a care facility for the past year. I set down my coffee cup and looked out the window at my garden, where the herbs were just beginning to show their spring growth. Was anyone with her? No. Victoria disappeared 18 months ago, after she was released on bail, took what money she could access and vanished. The facility said Catherine hadn't had visitors in over a year. The irony was perfect. Though I took no pleasure in it, Catherine had spent her final years exactly as she'd planned for me alone, confused, and forgotten by the family members she'd trusted most. And David, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He's been trying to locate you through my office. Victoria cleaned out their joint accounts before she disappeared, along with most of his assets. He lost the house, the cars, nearly everything. He's been asking about your will, whether there might be some provision for Emma's education. Arthur let the implication hang in the air. David wanted money, not reconciliation. Even now, even after losing everything to the woman he'd chosen over his mother, he still saw me primarily as a source of financial support. "The will stands as written," I said firmly. "Emma's trust remains intact, with the same conditions. If David wants to provide for his daughter's future, he can do it the way Thomas and I did, through hard work and sacrifice." That afternoon, I walked to the lighthouse at the edge of town, a route I'd taken hundreds of times over the past 3 years. The path wound through dune grass and wildflowers, past benches where couples watched sunsets and children built sandcastles. At the lighthouse, I sat on my favorite bench and opened the letter I'd carried in my purse for 3 years without reading. I'd written it during my final week in my old house, when the pain was still fresh and the future uncertain. "Dear Miranda, if you're reading this, it means you've survived something that was meant to break you. You've escaped people who tried to steal not just your money, but your mind, your dignity, and your right to exist on your own terms. You might feel guilty about the choices you've made, cutting ties, changing the will, walking away from family. Don't. Love that requires you to accept abuse isn't love at all. It's manipulation dressed up in pretty words. You might wonder if you were too harsh, too unforgiving. Remember the journal. Remember the photos. Remember the months of confusion and fear while people who claimed to love you slowly poisoned your body and your relationships. You survived because you were strong enough to trust yourself when everyone else told you to doubt your own mind. You saved yourself because no one else was going to do it. Build something beautiful with the life you've reclaimed. Honor Thomas's memory not by martyring yourself to people who betrayed you, but by living fully and fearlessly in the freedom you've earned. And remember, the best revenge isn't anger or hatred. It's happiness. It's peace. It's the knowledge that they couldn't destroy what mattered most: your sense of self, your capacity for joy, and your right to choose who deserves your love. Choose wisely. Choose yourself. The woman you used to be. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my purse. Tomorrow was Emma's 9th birthday, and though I couldn't send a card directly, I'd arranged for Arthur to deposit a small gift into her educational fund, enough for art classes or music lessons, whatever she might want to explore. In 16 years, she'd inherit enough money to change her life completely. She'd also inherit the truth about what happened to her grandmother and the knowledge that love and money aren't the same thing. By then, I'd likely be gone, but my story would remain not as a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people, but as proof that it's never too late to save yourself. As I walked home through the gathering dusk, past the community center where I'd helped dozens of seniors protect themselves from scams and abuse, past the cottage where I slept peacefully every night, past the garden where my herbs grew strong and fragrant, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and perfect contentment. They'd tried to erase me quietly, elegantly, with smiles and concern and carefully measured doses of chemicals that would have left me confused and compliant until the day I died. They'd planned to steal my legacy while appearing to care for my welfare. But I'd erased them instead, not with poison or manipulation, but with truth, courage, and the patient application of consequences. They'd lost their victim, their money, and their carefully constructed fiction of being loving family members. I'd lost a son, but I'd found myself in the arithmetic of survival. That was more than enough. The ocean wind carried the scent of salt and possibility as I turned the key in my front door, stepping into the home I'd built from freedom and funded with justice. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore with the rhythm of time itself, patient, persistent, and ultimately victorious over everything that tried to resist its power. Just like the truth, just like me. And that, my friends, is how Miranda Sterling took back her power without ever raising her voice. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't the loudest, it's the quietest. It's the patience to gather evidence, the wisdom to wait for the perfect moment, and the strength to walk away from people who never deserved your love in the first place. If this story gave you chills, if it made your heart race during those 35 minutes of waiting, or if Miranda's quiet strength inspired you in any way, please show your support by hitting that like button right now. Your likes tell me that these stories matter to you, and they help this channel reach other people who love psychological thrillers as much as we do. Don't keep this incredible story to yourself. Share it with someone who appreciates brilliant plot twists and strong characters who refuse to be victims. Share it with anyone who's ever felt underestimated or overlooked, because sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous of all. If you're new here and you loved Miranda's journey from victim to victor, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories coming your way, tales of justice, revenge, family secrets, and people who prove that it's never too late to fight back. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me. Now. I'm absolutely dying to know what you think. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you see any of those 5 twists coming, or did they catch you completely off guard? What was your favorite moment in Miranda's revenge? The glass switch, the evidence gathering, or maybe that final confrontation with David? Do you think Miranda was too harsh with her son, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Have you ever had to deal with someone like Victoria, someone who manipulates with a smile? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your thoughts, theories, and personal connections to these stories. Your engagement doesn't just support the channel, it helps me understand what kind of stories move you most. And speaking of what's coming next, let's just say the next story involves a woman who discovers her husband's secret life, an inheritance that comes with deadly strings attached, and a family reunion that turns into a psychological warfare. If you think Miranda's story was intense, wait until you hear what happens when someone pushes a retired detective's wife too far. Thank you so much for spending this time with Miranda and me. Thank you for listening to every twist, for feeling every emotion, and for joining me on this journey of justice and survival. Until next time. Remember, the quiet ones are always watching, always learning, and always waiting for the perfect moment to show the world who they really are. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to see you in the next story. Take care, and remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well.